of La Soufrire on the Caribbean island of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And during this PhD, I was supervised by Rebecca Williams, who's the volcanologist, Greg Bankoff, who's the environmental historian, and Bryony McDonough, who's an historical and cultural geographer who specializes in feminist geography. And throughout this PhD, I managed to get some additional support from the World Geographical Society, from VMSG, and from Geologists Association, so thank you to them. So before I begin, I just want to briefly touch upon my territorial acknowledgement. So this thesis was conducted on Caribbean islands that once belonged to two indigenous groups, the Kalinago and the Guafana. The Guafana were runaway slaves who intermarried with the Kalinago. And essentially, due to colonialism, these two groups are at more higher risk of the volcanic eruptions of La Soufrire. And essentially, this PhD has done its utmost best to represent their voices in the narrative of this thesis and to the history of the island, as those voices have been neglected in the past. So today I'm going to introduce you to the project, give you a brief history up until the eruption of 1812, my mixed methods approach, and then focusing on working with partial records and science voices, give you a brief insight into what happened during the eruption and then before a summary. So this project was a historical and social volcanology project. So this essentially combined history, social sciences, and physical volcanology and disaster management to understand the role of La Soufrire's eruptive history in the background of societal change. And when I say societal change, and was really coincidental of the historical eruptions of La Soufrire. So they happened at three distinct stages of social development. So 1812, what I'm going to be talking about today, happened during the slavery era. 1902 happened post-emancipation, and in 1979 happened before the island gained independence. So it's one of the arguments was that the volcanic eruptions is actually key in putting a lens on these social issues that these particular periods in time were experiencing. So the aim of the thesis was to reconstruct and determine the impacts of the three eruptions, focus particularly on the agricultural sector, as these were the prime economic providers during these three periods, and then any, or if not any, influence on societal behavior in terms of when it comes to risk, vulnerability, and resilience. So a very brief history of St. Vincent. So this map, these Google Maps don't do it justice, but this is where St. Vincent is. I like to describe it as a very tiny island with a big volcano on it. So it's in between St. Lucia, Barbados, and Grenada. And highlight, so even though the capital is Kingstown, the first actual settlement on the island is Bara Lee. And this was actually a French settlement. And I highlight this mainly because actually my grandfather is from Bara Lee as well. So it's a very personal connection to this island. And here's what's the crater looked like in 2016. I'm not sure if everybody knows this, but actually La Soufrire is currently erupting and creating a new lava dome around about. It's now kind of like snaking around the old dome. And this dome in the middle is the 1979 lava dome that happened after an explosive eruption. So it's one of the most active volcanoes in the Caribbean. So with a brief history, it's a really interesting history for St. Vincent. So archaeological evidence has shown that St. Vincent is a migration island from populations, particularly indigenous populations coming from South America, in particular Venezuela. These groups were very complex, distinct groups. Starting with one example is the Saladoids, but then they were absorbed and displaced by the Arawak, and then the Kalinago, around about 112 AD, absorbed and displaced the Arawak. So as I mentioned before, the Guafana were runaway African slaves who came from St. Lucia and Barbados and intermarried with the Kalinago. And I'll zoom in here. So it was discovered by Columbus in 1498, but left alone to seek riches in Latin America. In 1626, there was a small presence of French and slaves on the island. And during this time, the French and British colonial empires had a vested interests, but could not settle on the island due to the resistance of the indigenous peoples. St. Vincent was involved, the indigenous population of St. Vincent was involved in the wider campaign by the indigenous Kalinago and Grufana to fight French in Martinique in the 1640s, along with Dominica. And here we have our first recorded eruption in 1718. And the only thing we know about this is that it happened. We don't actually know exactly the exact details in terms of how destructive it was. Where did the geological kind of evidence that shows that it happened is. We have kind of like example of it appearing in old newspaper articles from Britain. And that's something I really would like to explore in the future, because we know it happened, we just don't know anything about it. In 1718, interestingly, Bara Lee was established as the first settlement on the island. In 1748, there was a treaty that declared St. Vincent neutral and the rightful property of the Kalinago and Grufana. However, during the 7 Years' War of 1756 to 1763, St. Vincent was seceded to Britain following the Treaty of Paris. And after this, a reserve for the Kalinago and Grufana was established in the north, closer to La Soufrire. During the period of 1771 to 1808, approximately 57,500 slaves were imported. And in 1812, specifically, there are around about 18,050 slaves on the island. During this period of time, there was a bit of, I would say, tensions, because British colonists were attempting to secure land through voluntary sale, military force, and encroachment after they realized that the sugar plantations in the south of the island were not as productive, and actually figuring out whether they could access the fertile soil, which was in the north end of the island, because, of course, it's well established, even back then, that volcanic activity creates these fertile lands. And actually this encroachment, despite the fact that the Grufana and Kalinago, even though they didn't want to give up their lands, they accepted that they had this land in the north, and they essentially said, if you leave us alone, we'll leave you alone. But because the colonists didn't leave them alone, this actually led to the First Carib War in 1769 to 1773. And as part of the American Revolution campaign in 1779, the French recaptured the island. And then in 1780, we have our first recorded hurricane. And then in 1783, we had the Treaty of Versailles that ended the American Revolution and seceded St. Vincent back to Britain. And there was basically more tensions between the British and the indigenous peoples that led to the Second Carib War in 1795 to 1797, which resulted in the exile of just over 4,300 Grufana to an island of present-day Honduras, where now their descendants now populate mainly Central America. And this in 1804, we have the largest plantation states closest to La Soufrire starting production. And then we have the 1812 eruption. So quite, I suppose, different for a group such as the Geological Society of Leicester. I actually did quite a lot of qualitative research and looking at letters. So, for example, this is a letter from an admiral who was based in Barbados, and he was going to investigate what happened in St. Vincent during the 1812 eruption, but he had to turn his ship around because he encountered a strong downwind of ash, and so he had to turn around. I also use diaries. So in 1812, there was an American magistrate who's actually was on St. Vincent, and he actually recorded his own kind of experiences of encountering this volcanic eruption. I also use geologists' field notebooks and historical research papers. So in the UK, we had two prominent, well, we had a geologist and a volcanologist, Sir John Flett, who was only Dr. John Flett back when this eruption happened in 1902. But then we also have Dr. Tempest Anderson as the volcanologist. They were instructed by the Royal Society to go and investigate what was happening during the 19 eruption of La Soufrière on St. Vincent and also La Montagne Pelée on Martinique, as these two eruptions happened relatively close together. So they were sent there. But this notebook is actually from an American geologist called Dr. Edmund Hovey, who was assistant curator in the paleontology department at the American Museum of Natural History. And he was also instructed to investigate what was happening in these two eruptions. So this was a very useful collection to go and see. I also use historical maps, and these were mainly just to see what the land use was and what kind of the territory was like, and also trying to think what would it be like if you were a volcanologist and you had to use like your topography maps that you had back then. Of course, you could see topography back then was not that great, so it was kind of interesting exercise to see how they would work with that. You also use governmental correspondence. So St. Vincent was part of a collective of administration called the Windward Islands. And as you know, this is what it's still called today. But the headquarters for the Windward Islands was in Barbados. So there was a lot of governmental correspondence coming from the local council and government on St. Vincent to the government in Barbados and the governor in Barbados to then be sent to London to the Colonial Office. And these recorded such as like reports and investigations into damage done and so on. Fortunately for 1902 and 1979, there's lots of photographs survived. So this particular photograph is quite interesting. So this was actually in Tempest Anderson's collection, which is in the Yorkshire Museum. But if you can see on the side, it says that this is a negative made for the American Museum of Natural History by EOH, so Edmund Otis Hovey. So what was interesting was that Tempest Anderson and Edmund Hovey were actually speaking to one another and swapping these negative plates, as both of them were taking photographs of what they saw when they went to investigate the aftermath of these two eruptions. And this particular photograph was after the first initial explosion of La Soufrière. So the first explosion was 7th of May, and they managed to get there around about the 30th of May to start the investigations. I also use newspaper articles, and this, of course, despite being dramatized to capture the audience and obviously try and sell them, they still actually contain quite a lot of information in terms of what and where happened. And I could do this for 1812. So this is actually a newspaper article from 1812. And because 1979 is still in living memory, particularly when I was there in 2016, I conducted interviews to get personal, localized experiences of how people responded to the 1979 eruption. And what I did with most of this data was create these eruption impact maps. So I would take a description, I would then locate it onto a map, a paper-based copy map. I would color code it and label it in relation to volcanic hazard. So I was looking at lahars, which are volcanic mud flows, pyroclastic density currents, or their old term, pyroclastic flows, to volcanic earthquakes, and also to ashfall. And then I would digitize these layers of where the hazards went. So this is not a true geological map that you would expect when investigating a volcanic eruption. This is more determining what and where in terms of relation to the maps. And this was just to help me triangulate my later chapters in terms of how the society was impacted. But as you can tell, with archive records, they can be incomplete, although we can get situations where, for example, the 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius, where they're quite detailed, but generally speaking, they can be quite patchy. So historical records of volcanic activity can miss the recording of discrete activity, contain periods where data was not recorded, or contain random or systematic errors. And typically, the further back you go in time, the less reliable they are. And with archives in particular, they have what we call a cultural filter on them. So these affect the reliability, availability, and the completeness, as records have various biases associated with the periods and location in which they were taken. To counteract this, I basically got a lot of data from the archives to try and triangulate what was being said. And of course, here I was being trained by two historians essentially to think critically when engaging with these archive sources. And also quite unusual in volcanology and in geology is that I implied feminist theory. So I used a particular feminist theory called feminist standpoint theory, which utilizes voice as data, essentially, which says that members of marginalized groups can become subjects and authors of knowledge, speaking from a certain location, experience, and standpoint, which is particularly important in social volcanology. And the framing of individual and collective identities, subjectivities, and positioning are part of the identity work of studying voice. And this replaces coherent, explicit, and systematically principled and hierarchy, organized knowledge with the oral, context-dependent, and such segmentally organized local knowledges. So this all came about how I introduced feminist theory was that when I was particularly looking at the archive information of 1812 and 1902, I noticed that it was only being written by one particular person, which was the white elite men. And I was questioning, well, where are the experiences of the indigenous peoples? Where are the experiences of the slaves, the women, the children, disabled, and other marginalized groups? Because as we know, society is not just made up of one particular person. And in particularly social volcanology, it's really important to try and capture the experiences of as wide range of people as possible, because volcanic eruptions impact such a wide range of people, and particularly for a small island like St. Vincent, it impacts the whole entire island. And so it's really important to try and get as much diverse voices and experiences as possible. So more of the exciting stuff, I guess, if you can think about it that way. So the 1812 eruption of La Soufrère erupted for 6 weeks, around about on a volcanic explosivity index of 4, so quite substantial for a small island like St. Vincent. The tephra covered, this is just based solely on the archives that I picked out. The tephra area mainly covered about the northern portion of the island. There was quite a few lahars that impacted a few rivers. There was quite a number of pyroclastic density currents that impacted area. I'll go into more detail. This has maps in later. The population was just under 27,000. The amount of people evacuated was 3%. And the amount of people killed was about 0.2%. But I'd just like to state that this number of people killed, these were mainly slaves, all slaves actually, and this number may not be the true reflection of how many people died, because we have to remember slaves were viewed as property, not people. And it was very hard for me, looking through the archives, to distinguish between, when reporting property damage from plantations, how slaves were encountered to that, because they weren't distinguished between the two. So this, I'm going to just go through the first week of activity because that's where most of the information is contained. So the eruption starts at around 2 p.m. midday on the 27th of April, with ash falling at Wallabu and Montrond. So Wallabu is the lower circle and Montrond is the upper circle. On the 30th of April, ashfall is reported to fall at Mount Alexander Estate, which is around here, a bit lower down on the western flank, but also Barbados. So we have an arrow pointing at Barbados as well. But also, 30th of April, we have first recorded volcanic earthquake in the Montronde area. We also have the first reports of pyroclastic density currents impacting Rabaka Estate, which is on the eastern flank, to Valleys Estate, which is north western flank. And then we have other pyroclastic density currents happening later in the day in Montronde and Larrakai River. And Larrakai River is just north of Montronde. And then 1st of May, we don't have actually reports of anything happening on the island, but we have reports of ash falling over the surrounding Caribbean islands. So there's ash reported falling over Barbados, Martinique, Dominica, St. Lucia, and Grenada. So even though we don't have any information on the island, we could expect that actually was quite a big eruption, that explosion that happened. On 2nd of May, we have the first reports of what's happening in the north end of the island, where a village called Fancy and a place called Awea, they actually are reported to be buried in ashfall. And then no reports for the next few days, but on the 5th of May, we have more ash falling over Barbados, but nothing reported on the island. And then 7th of May, we have another recording of pyroclastic density currents happening in the Rabaka, so eastern flank, and Wallabu rivers, which is the western flank. And also we have the first report of a lahar happening in the Montronde River, which flows through the village of Montronde. However, because of how far back this eruption goes, a lot of these activity reported don't actually have any dates or times associated with them. So there's more so there's general reports of ashfall happening more on the eastern flank and on the windward side of the island, from Trurama to Grand Sable. This is far south on the east as the ashfall is reported. There's an unknown earthquake that happens in the general Rabaka area. We also have more reports of pyroclastic density currents impacting more of the eastern flank and the western flank. And there's also reports of a lahar happening in Trurama and Rabaka, but also one that happens either in 1713 or 1714 in Wallabu. And it's essentially the impact map are created from all that information. And interestingly, which is similar to next eruptions in 1902, is that people in Kingstown actually felt the kind of like the ground vibrations from the explosions caused by La Soufrire. So it was recorded as an earthquake being felt. Just to zone in more on the pyroclastic density currents and lahars. So essentially what happened is we had a mixture of currents that was channelized down river valleys, particularly on eastern and western flank. And interesting one for the one that happened in the north area that's destroyed to Valleys Estate. This is actually might actually be a debris avalanche, because in 1812 there's actually although I couldn't find any reports of it itself, but later research, particularly geology research, that actually in 1812, it created its own new crater, and it's only erupted from this crater once. But that actually, with the triangulating all the information and the descriptions of these avalanches, that actually translates to actually this is just actually the material that was blown out and actually traveling down the valleys. And I see here in lahars, they happened in 4 valleys, and yeah, this was a particularly dangerous event, but because there's not many people on the island during this time, it was not as deadly as the 1902 eruption, which was catastrophically worse in terms of how many people died. So what this map shows is the number of sugar plantations in operation from 1801 to 1924, and there were about 129 estates in production. However, if you can see with this map and overlaying the impact eruption map, only around about 9 estates were subjected to the greater impacts of lahars and pyroclastic density currents. And how these things were, the damages to plantations were reported was actually quite general. And it was a little bit frustrating. So for example, I've got a quote here from the governor, Sir Charles Brisbane, to the administrator of the Windward Islands. He said, "The eruption has overwhelmed and nearly utterly destroyed several plantations and done injury to others. The contents of the volcano covered the earth for a considerable depth and entirely stopped or resolved the springs of 2 of the largest rivers in the colony from which their mills were supplied with water. And these 2 springs were Rebecca Dry River and Wallaboo River." So here I did manage to find estimated loss in pounds and shillings. So I don't want you to absorb all this information. I want you to just draw your attention to some of these. So Grand Stubble. So interestingly, Grand Stubble, there was confirmed damage by the manager's house on the plantation was received roof collapse. But this amount of money is estimated, it kind of made me suspicious, considering that estates more susceptible to more than just ashfall didn't receive as much that I thought that they should have. And interestingly, I did find a letter later on that actually might have shed light onto how Colonel Thomas Brown got more than others. So with this, the colonial government tried to buy land off him to rehouse displaced slaves. And Thomas Brown, in his colorful racist views, refused, essentially. But this led to the military coming in and basically persuading him at gunpoint to give up land. And essentially, this money was part, sort of like as compensation to him to purchase the land and to persuade him to give up the land. Another one I want to draw your attention to is Korea. So Korea, there was no reports of damage in the archives, but there was one source that I used a lot that it was abandoned in 1812. So I thought that was quite interesting. But I managed to find that it was William Mackenzie. He not only owned Korea, but he owned Truamar, and Truamar did have confirmed damages. And as you can see, it received not only ashfall, but pyroclastic damage and also lahar damage. So what happened here was that Mackenzie sold Korea to fund the repairs at Truamar. And then lastly, Duvalis and Thomas Fraser. So Duvalis and Thomas Fraser, they were both abandoned in 1812 because they were both confirmed destroyed as a result of the pyroclastic density currents. However, by 1902, they were established settlements again. So by 1902, Duvalis was called Windsor Forest, and Thomas Fraser estate became Fraser's Village. And both again in 1902 were destroyed. And consequently, they are now permanently abandoned locations. But for that, it's thinking that, did they learn from the mistakes from 1812, or did they decide that actually the benefits of the fertile land outweigh the risks of another volcanic eruption? Here, this is just a graph showing the production of sugar in pounds, as in by weight. And I just want to draw your attention to 1812. So essentially, there was a drop in production as a result of volcanic eruption. And actually, the eruption displaced quite a bit of land, make it unusable for a number of years. I think I have the actual number on the next slide. But if you can see that actually 1 year or 2 years to 3 years afterwards, the production shoots up. And that's related to incorporating that fertile soil, the fertile product from the eruption into the soil, excuse me, and perhaps, of course, quickly replacing lost labor of the slaves. Ooh. Oh, yes. Yes. Okay, so nearly done. So in terms of social behaviors for 1812, it was very hard to pinpoint exactly what happened. And this map here on the right is essentially all of the volcanic eruptions, eruption impact maps overlaid one another. So we have 1812 eruption, lahars and pyroclastic currents, 1902 and 1979. But we also have settlements between each eruptions that spring up. And we also have the Windward Highway, which, as you can see, only goes up to Fancy. And this is because the western flank to northwestern flank is essentially inaccessible because it's just so rocky and raggedy that you can't actually build through it. So in terms of evacuation behaviors, so in 1812, there was documentation of self-evacuation. So in particular, the village of Momrond was the first to self-evacuate. And interestingly, these were an indigenous Kalinago village. So they first evacuated to Chateau-Belair, which is just down here. And that's the nearest biggest town on the western flank. And then they evacuated to Kingstown, so further south to the island. And similar to 1902, Momrond, the village of Momrond also evacuated days before ash column collapse, so generation of pyroclastic currents. And this is because they felt these volcanic earthquakes and they knew that something would happen. So it was indicative that there was an in-depth knowledge of their environment and the volcano. But now that knowledge has been lost because they permanently relocated to south to an area called Rosebank, where the descendants live today. And because they're essentially in a different part of the island, a different part of an environment, they won't actually have that intrinsic knowledge of the volcano and their environment and understand the signals because they're no longer actually directly underneath it. In terms of resettlement, so some Kalinago families were actually permanently relocated to Tobago Island, which at the time was uninhabited. So it was just a normal little old island in the Caribbean that was not inhabited. And so this was on behalf of the Kalinago families, the administrator of the Windward Islands and the governor, Sir Charles Bisman, arranged this. So in a letter to the governor of Trinidad from the administrator says, this unfortunate event has struck them with such terror that they cannot be persuaded to settle again in the island, and there is no other crown land near the sea fit for inhabitation. They are therefore anxious to leave for the island of Trinidad. So essentially, the Kalinago were probably perhaps the first inhabitants of Tobago Island. So in terms of livelihoods, because of the voices of slaves, freed persons, and Kalinago Gufana were pretty much absent in 1812, it was very hard to make a judgment on this. But when data referring to the impacts on jobs was very general, such as work much injured. So it can be assumed, however, that disruption was on all aspects of agriculture, including crop and byproduct production of rum and molasses, storage, transportation, and trading. So the eruption temporarily reduced cultivable land by about 6,080 acres that limited production. However, as demonstrated from the previous slide, the focus is on returning to the status quo as quickly as possible to meet the demands of the British Empire in producing sugar, rather than adapting and diversifying, which we would see and hope would happen in disasters and crises and emergencies. With relation to the British West Indies, so in 1812, it was more of a geopolitical connection with other British West Indies islands, but this transformed into more of a kingship by sharing a common bond understanding, which explains the prompt response of disaster assistance following disaster today. For example, the recent, was it Hurricane Marie? I can't remember the exact name, but basically the sequence of hurricanes that really just devastated the Caribbean. Essentially, it was the surrounding Caribbean islands that really responded quicker to helping and providing assistance, particularly financial assistance. The connectivity before European contact found through archaeological evidence was that the Caribbean Sea was more of an aquatic motorway, which contradicts the notion of insularity and the framing of island vulnerability, which in itself reinforces colonial preconceptions of the Caribbean's indigenous past. And from this data, for 1812 in particular, most of the aid came from Britain and Barbados. From 1902, this expanded to more British islands, as well as foreign and other colonial powers as well, because of how devastating the eruption was. Okay, so in summary, investigating eruptive history in the background of social change helps to examine how each eruption's impacts can differ. Mixed methods approach in social volcanology requires multiple data sets to be integrated to capture the complexity of living volcanic eruptions. However, due to partial records and science viruses, this means that the full picture of impact is never truly complete. La Soufrière's 1812 eruption occurred during the slavery era and after a period of conflict between colonial powers and two cultural groups. It was 6 weeks at a volcanic explosive index of 4, dominantly impacting the north end of the island and neighboring islands. Estimated damages by estate owners hid stories of additional financial gain. Sugar cane production decreased but recovered relatively quickly, and Kalinago migrated to Tobago, and some slaves were rehoused at Grand Supple. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. That was awesome. Thank you very much, Jazz.
Thank you.
Yeah, so without further ado, if you're okay to take questions, I'd like to open up the floor for any questions. Yep, so if you have questions, if you can stick them in the Q&A box or in the chat. Whilst we're waiting, I have not so much a question, but I'm quite familiar with your work, Jazz, as you know.